very warm welcome to Durham University on this May Day evening. My name is Tom McLeish. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, and that means that I received the enormous privilege of chairing our guest this evening and yourselves to this fifth King Hussein annual lecture. These lectures have been founded. They're a series on intercultural dialogue. They're founded to promote understanding, creative solutions to the cultural clashes and frictions and rubbings up of culture against culture in today's world. They're given under the auspices of the Durham IES, Institute of Advanced Studies, whose director, Veronica Strang, is in the front row today. And they've been developed with the guidance of HRH Prince Hassan bin Talal of Jordan, who delivered the first in November 2008. Baroness Helena Kennedy delivered the second. Professor Charles Tripp from the School of Oriental African Studies, Mark Steers from Oxford gave the fourth, and tonight's guest, Baroness Maeve Sherlock, will deliver the fifth. I'm sure our guest speaker tonight needs very little, if any, words from me about her, but I should nonetheless, for the record, which is over there, record that for us that she's a life peer. She's opposition spokesperson on works and pensions in, of course, the House of Lords. She's an officer of the all-party parliamentary group on poverty, and for 7 months served as the Labour nominee for the Riots Committee and Victims Panel set up by the Prime Minister in the wake of the 2011 riots. So reconciliation is no stranger to her portfolio. Before entering the Lords in 2010, she spent actually most of her career leading charities, including the Refugee Council. She was also, I'm not quite sure to add for her sins or not at this point, served 3 years in the Treasury under Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, and has also held a number of non-executive roles, having served as Commissioner for the Equality of Human Rights Commission and a former President of the National Union of Students. She has a particular link to this university by St Chad's College, that you know, where she's come to take an MA in theology, and I believe a PhD. Is currently a PhD student of the University of Durham. So come full circle, which is a wonderful thing. I think when we together alighted on the subject of today's lecture, I don't think anyone quite anticipated how topical it would end up to be. Only in the last month we have had a Prime Minister saying that we're a Christian country, his deputy saying that we're not and that we should separate church and state, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, Roe Williams, saying that we're a post-Christian country, but that doesn't mean we're a non-Christian country. Of course, Justin Welby then weighs in. Of course, his primary claim to fame is that he's a graduate of this university and a former Bishop of Durham, but I'm told he's also moved on recently to another role. Has said that it's a historical fact that the UK's laws, ethics and culture are based on the teachings of the Church willy-nilly. We are in a confusing and turbulent storm. Baroness Sherlock, would you please rescue us?
Provost Chancellor, thank you so much. Well, what a great introduction. I shall do my best to live up to it and will undoubtedly fail, but you've also stolen some of my best lines, so thanks for that. And I just want to say also thank you very much to the university and to the IAS in particular, to Veronica and her colleagues for inviting me. I've been aware of the IAS's work since I came to Durham in 2006, and I just love this whole project of bringing in world-class scholars to look at really interesting subjects in a properly interdisciplinary way. It's fantastic. I think they're doing some of the most exciting thinking around. So if you're in Durham and haven't engaged with them yet, I really encourage you to do so. And it's a huge privilege to be asked to give this lecture in the wake of some of my colleague, Helena Kennedy, and of Mark Steers and people like Charles Tripp. So thank you so much. As Tom mentioned, I am the opposition Labour spokesperson on work and pensions, but I should say tonight I am not offering you a Labour view on an intercultural dilemma. I'm simply going to offer my own rather random thoughts. And I am indeed a PhD student, but both of my supervisors are sitting here close to the front. So when it comes to questions, if you could just comment on how brilliant it was before you ask them, greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. So, as Tom mentioned, I was going to do something fairly obscure and academic, and all of a sudden, in the last few weeks, this issue got catapulted into centre stage. So I decided to shift and start off looking initially at what's been happening in politics. As I'm sure you will know, unless you went away for Easter to Mars, the Prime Minister David Cameron released an Easter message in the form of a video on YouTube. In it, he said how much he valued the church and Christianity. He declared religious freedom was a fundamental human right and condemned the treatment of Christians around the world. He celebrated what he called the daily countless acts of kindness carried out by those who believe in and follow Christ. He mentioned alpha courses in prisons, soup kitchens, homeless shelters, even parish priests canoeing through flooded villages to rescue stranded parishioners. Mr. Cameron also held an Easter reception for Christian leaders in Downing Street, and he wrote an article in the Church Times in which he talked about his own Christian faith. My faith in the Church of England. David Cameron expresses his pride in its openness, beauty, social action and pastoral care. Now this caused a lot of controversy. But why? Why should British politicians not mention their religion? It would be unremarkable in many countries, but it is unusual here, especially in modern times. And it's certainly unusual for politicians, if not to let their faith be known, then to make it part of their public political persona. Now, that was once, of course, much more common. Gladstone was a very Christian Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury was a practising Anglican, and Stanley Baldwin was known to be a man of sincere Christian faith. And on the Labour benches, Keir Hardie was a Methodist lay preacher. George Lansbury was a Christian. The late John Smith, who was leader of the opposition in the 1990s, was well known to be both a product and adherent of the Christian socialist movement, a movement with a long history in Labour. But if anyone mentions religion and politics, the person that comes to most people's minds is not a politician at all, but an advisor. Alistair Campbell, of course. Official spokesperson for Tony Blair when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. And this, of course, is all because of something that happened in 2003, when Blair was being interviewed for an article for Vanity Fair to mark his 50th birthday. And according to reports at the time, during the interview, the journalist David Margolick asked Tony Blair about his religion, and in particular the extent to which it bonded him to President George W. Bush. And at that point, Alistair Campbell, who had been there throughout the interview but had said nothing, intervened and said, "We don't do God. I'm sorry, we don't do God." Now, I had been in a discussion with Alistair Campbell about this, and he says he did say this indeed, but he saw it as a throwaway line, and he expressed surprise at the extent to which it has in fact become his most famous utterance. But perhaps it wasn't that surprising that Tony Blair and his team were fairly wary of talking about faith. He'd been burned early on, before he even became Prime Minister, as a result of an article in the Sunday Telegraph in 1996, in which he said that his Christian values led him to oppose a narrow view of self-interest as embraced by modern conservatism. This prompted huge outrage amongst Conservatives, and also a vast amount of media commentary, and began the portrayal of him as the Reverend Blair, which took place for some years to come. And after he left office, Blair said this: "If you are in the American political system or others, then you can talk about religious faith, and people say, yes, that's fair enough, and it is something they respond to quite naturally. You talk about it in our system, and frankly, people do think you're a nutter. I mean, you may go off and sit in the corner and commune with the man upstairs and then come back and say, right, I've been told the answer, and that's it." But despite his reticence and the advice from Alistair Campbell not to do God, religion surfaced repeatedly during Blair's premiership, including whether his own faith affected his political decisions and his relationships with other leaders, whether he was going to convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism, something he eventually did only after leaving office. But also there were periodic debates about the place of religion in politics, in policy and in service delivery, some of which I'm going to return to. But actually interesting, David Cameron, I think, has gone a lot further than Tony Blair ever did. not only did he give those Easter greetings, but the Church Times article said this about religion. Some people feel that in this ever more secular age, we shouldn't talk about these things. I completely disagree. I believe we should be more confident about our status as a Christian country, more ambitious about expanding the role of faith-based organisations, and frankly more evangelical about a faith that compels us to get out there and make a difference to people's lives. Now, for the benefit of the theologians in tonight, yes, I do think he meant evangelistic, not evangelical, but we're going to let him get away with that just for now. But as the article carries on, Cameron makes a case for faith as a source of counsel in hard times, a driver for social action, as something that helps people to have a moral code. He also declares he respects the Church of England's national role, and he likes its openness, its liturgy, its churches, and its work in education. And he says that greater confidence in our Christianity can inspire a belief that we can change lives and improve what he calls the spiritual, physical, and moral state of our country and even the world. Of his own faith, Cameron says, I am a member of the Church of England, and I suspect a rather classic one, not that regular in attendance, and a bit vague on some of the more difficult parts of the faith. He also says that some fault the Church of England for perceived woolliness when it comes to belief. I am not one for doctrinal purity, and I don't believe it's essential for evangelism about the Church's role in our society. This is strong stuff in British political terms, and it's a notch up from Cameron's previous description of his Christian faith as being a bit like the reception for the radio station Magic FM in the Chilterns. It sort of comes and goes. Now, as you will have noticed, this intervention caused a fairly big reaction. Some people thought it was simply a mistake. The Guardian's Anne Perkins warned that mixing faith and politics is treacherous territory in Britain. Other people were sceptical about his motivation in doing it, suggesting either that he was trying to distract attention from the scandal-hit Culture Secretary Maria Miller, or that it was a sort of dog whistle to disgruntled Conservative voters who might be tempted to flirt with UKIP. An example like this is the Sky News. Cameron's Easter message not just about God. David Cameron's message for Britain to get evangelical isn't about reconnecting with the church, but the Tory unfaithful. In fact, the article underneath that from the Sky's political correspondent Anushka Asthana said, the Conservatives' approach is a risky one, but it is calculated too. A message designed to offer comfort slips inoffensively past non-believers or those of other faiths and lands squarely at the feet of disgruntled Christians who could vote Tory yet. But there were also very positive responses to what Cameron had to say, most notably, as Tom mentioned, from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who said that Cameron's remarks should be uncontroversial, since, as you already know, thanks, it is a historical fact, perhaps unwelcome to some, but true, that our main systems of ethics, the way we do law and justice, the values of society, how we decide what is fair, the protection of the poor, and most of the way we look at society, all have been shaped by and founded on Christianity. Now, Justin Welby did note that in terms of church-going, this is not a Christian country, a point also made by Rowan Williams. But in essence, I think they were both making the same broad point. Justin Welby summarised it like this. The language of what we are, what we care for, and how we act is earthed in Christianity and would remain so for many years, even if the number of believers dropped out of sight, which they won't, in my opinion. Now, not all Christians were as positive. Giles Fraser wrote in the Mail, yes, bless you, Dave, for doing God. He said, apart from that heading, he said, I thank the Prime Minister for his words of support for Christians. Yet most politicians who speak of God look about as comfortable as my dad does breakdancing. Which I have as a lesson for me, which sadly at this point I realise I failed to heed. Perhaps, said Giles, that is why Alistair Campbell advised Tony Blair so strongly against it. His real problem, though, was that Cameron had not described Christianity properly. Jesus didn't come to be nice, said Giles Fraser. As he put it, no one was ever crucified for kindness. Jesus was not strung up on a hideous Roman instrument of torture because of his good deeds. If Jesus is just a remarkably good person, whose example we ought to follow, why the need for the dark and difficult story of betrayal and death? And some of the media just had a laugh at David Cameron's expense. Lovely service, Vicar, but I think you should leave God to the politicians. But then, of course, came the backlash, most prominently from a letter to the Telegraph on the 20th of April, Easter Monday to some people, from a group of signatories from a humanist and secularist perspective, headed by Jamal Khalil and Philip Pullman. The letter allowed that Cameron was entitled to his religious beliefs, but objected to his characterisation of Britain as a Christian country. It continued, "We are a plural society with citizens with a range of perspectives, and we are a largely non-religious society. Constantly to claim otherwise fosters alienation and division in our society." Now, I presume that refers to fostering division between Christians and people of other faiths. That's often the argument made against allowing any space for any religion, and one can't privilege one faith over another, so let us not allow space for any of them. Now, I have to say, in my experience, the objections rarely come from other faiths. They almost always come from those who object to religion in general in the public sphere. And this is no exception. Justin Welby challenged the assumption in the letter that expressing confidence in the country's Christian identity fosters alienation and division, noting that non-Christian faith leaders, including representatives of Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, had spoken out in support of Mr. Cameron. In fact, Farouk Murad of the Muslim Council of Britain said, "No one can deny that Britain remains largely a Christian country, with deep historical and structural links with the established church. We respect that." But in many ways, I was surprised that we hadn't heard the secularist voice louder and earlier than we did. After all, it's not so long ago that the view was spreading that essentially we were in not just a post-Christian, but a post-religion world. It was widely assumed religion would do the decent thing and withdraw gently from public life and any involvement with the state. Believers would dwindle in number, and such religion as remained would essentially be a personal and private matter. This, as every politics student knows, is in its purest form known as secularisation theory, which probably reached its pinnacle in the 1960s. Nick Spencer reviewed the history in a neat little book called Doing God, A Future for Faith in the Public Square. In it, he cited the sociologist Peter Berger, writing in the New York Times in 1968, suggesting that in the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. 30 years later, Berger had a slightly different view. The assumption that we live in a secularised world is false. The world today, with some exceptions, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. Berger continues, this means that a whole body of literature by historians and social scientists, loosely labelled secularisation theory, is essentially mistaken, but he acknowledged that his own early work had in fact contributed to that literature. So without question, religion now is back, if it ever went away. Now, this isn't the time or place for a lecture on secularisation theory, but the practical outworking of the subject is of a lot of interest to me, both academically, professionally and personally. So what I want to do is to take a canter around the territory as it looks just from where I happen to stand. And I'm going to touch on three issues. Firstly, the manifestations of religion in public. Second, religion and public services. And thirdly, religious arguments in the public square. So first, manifesting one's religion in public. When it comes to religion, the media are fascinated with what people wear. I mean, it's just a national obsession. Over the years, there's been a steady drip of stories about everything. About turbans, about wearing crosses, about silver chastity rings, silver ring thing, anybody? About, of course, hijabs and veils of every kind. There's something about dress and symbolism that seems to get to the heart of the issues. It provokes a sort of visceral response to difference. The first time I really became aware of the issue in a British political context, I think, was probably in 2005. Some of you may remember the case of Aisha Azmi, a Muslim classroom assistant who lost her job because she refused to remove her niqab, a face veil, when she was working with children in a classroom. She was allowed to wear it in the school at other times. The school took the view that children would find it easier to communicate with her if they could see her face, and particularly her mouth, if they were going to be able to learn from her, and including learning language. She lost her job and she lodged a claim for religious discrimination at a tribunal. She lost and went to appeal and lost there as well. The Employment Appeals Tribunal ruled that there had been indirect discrimination, but that it was justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, namely optimising the education of the children. Now, the case had a lot of media coverage, of which this is just one. Veil case teacher cost us £250,000 by going to Europe. She didn't, I don't think. But it ran and ran. There was another veil case in the last year in Birmingham Metropolitan College, which had for some time banned students, staff and visitors from wearing face veils on security grounds. They then subsequently rescinded the ban after complaints by Muslim students of discrimination against them. And most recently, there was a widespread coverage of a court case in which a woman appeared in Blackfriars Crown Court veiled and refused to reveal her face on the grounds that as a Muslim, she could not appear unveiled in the presence of men who were not part of her immediate family. The judge decided that she could not give evidence veiled because he decided it was essential to the proper working of an adversarial trial that everybody involved, the judge, the jury, the witnesses and the defendant, should all be able to see each other during the proceedings, partly for identification, but also to assess the credibility of witnesses. But it's not just veils. In the UK, the most long-running case I know of was probably that of Nadia Ouida, who worked on a British Airways check-in desk. British Airways refused her permission to wear a small cross on a necklace on the grounds that it didn't fit in with its uniform policy. BA said it wanted to maintain a consistent corporate image so no member of staff working with customers could wear jewellery for any reason. There was a similar case. A nurse called Shirley Chaplin was refused permission by her NHS trust to wear a small cross on a train, in that case on grounds of health and safety, in case a patient grabbed it and hurt themselves or her. Both women went to tribunals, arguing their employers were being inconsistent, because their uniform policies made allowances for the needs of members of other faiths, including Muslims and Sikhs. Both lost their cases in the British courts, and the cases went all the way to Europe. Last year, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in favour of Nadia Ouida. I'd like to quote briefly from the judgment. The court concluded that a fair balance had not been struck. It said, on one side of the scales was Ms. Ouida's desire to manifest her religious belief. As previously noted, this is a fundamental right, because a healthy democratic society needs to tolerate and sustain pluralism and diversity, but also because of the value to an individual who has made religion a central tenet of his or her life to be able to communicate that belief to others. The court said that on one side of the scales was Nadia Ouida, on the other side of the scales was the employer's wish to project a certain corporate image. The court saw that as a legitimate aim, but although it was undoubtedly legitimate, they believed the domestic courts had given too much weight to that aim. The court took the view that the cross was small and discreet, it didn't detract from her professional appearance, and there was no evidence that the wearing of other things, such as turbans or hijabs by members of staff, had done any damage to BA's image. Shirley Chaplin, on the other hand, lost her case. The court observed that, in its view, the protection of health and safety on a hospital ward was inherently of a greater magnitude than the issues applying in the case of Nadia Ouida. And it felt in particular that health and safety was something where it ought to give a wider margin to the British courts to decide what they thought was right, and also more margin to the decisions of the individual hospital manager. If anybody wants a more detailed analysis of the judgment, there's an article by Ian Lee of this university and Andrew Hambler in the current issue of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. Now, the BBC cited a range of reactions to that judgment when it came out, which are quite interesting. It was welcomed, perhaps unsurprisingly, by the Archbishop of York, I now think wholly unsurprisingly, by David Cameron, the Prime Minister. But a lot of other reactions were quite interesting. Shami Chakrabarti, the director of Liberty, the human rights group, said it was an excellent result for equal treatment, religious freedom and common sense. From a slightly different perspective was Keith Porteous-Wood of the National Secular Society. He said, religious people who feel elements of their job go against their conscience can always find employment that better matches their needs. That is true religious freedom. Now, actually, I think those two quotes get to the heart of the matter. Is religious freedom about having a right to manifest your religion unless there is a compelling balancing reason to constrain that right? Or is it simply being free in the sense that you can always go and find another job with an employer who doesn't mind if you manifest your religion? You may be unsurprised to think that I favour the former view. I think to me that feels fairly obvious, but of course it really isn't. Let's look at the situation in France. Since 2004, French law has prohibited state employees from wearing prominent religious symbols, such as crosses or Jewish skull caps or veils. In 2004, it also became illegal to wear any kind of overtly religious dress in French state schools. That covers not just the niqab or the burqa, but the hijab, the skull cap, the Sikh turban or patka. More recently, since 2011, French law has banned the wearing of any outfit in a public place which is intended to hide your face. The penalty for breaking the law is a fine of up to €150 and/or obligatory participation in citizenship education. Frank Cranmer reports on his excellent blog Law and Religion UK that the first to fall foul of this new law were two women who in September 2011 were fined €120 and €80 respectively for wearing niqab in public. In December 2011, one of the same women was then ordered to attend a 15-day citizenship course by another court for having worn a niqab in a protest outside the Élysée Palace. But things in certain places could go farther yet. It's been reported in the media that Marine Le Pen, the leader of the anti-immigration far-right Front National party in France, says that in any town where her party wins local control, school canteens will no longer offer non-pork meal options, with reference, of course, to the fact that at the moment alternatives are offered to Muslim or Jewish students. She says, "We will accept no religious requirements in the school lunch menus. There is no reason for religion to enter into the public sphere." She defended the decision as necessary to save secularism. Belgium also passed a law banning face coverings in 2011. Gavin Titley, writing in The Guardian on the 15th of April, reported that, and I quote, "In what it later predictably described as a joke, the Flemish Vlaams stormed a food festival at a school in Schoten and reportedly forced pork sausages into the mouths of some children." Perhaps inspired by the French, thankfully not the Belgians, the Conservative MP Philip Hollobone recently introduced a private member's bill into Parliament called the Face Covering Prohibitions Bill, the first clause of which says that subject to certain exemptions, a person wearing a garment or other object intended by the wearer as its primary purpose to obscure the face in a public place shall be guilty of an offence. The bill began its second reading on the 28th of February, but ran out of time and was adjourned till May. It may or may not resume. Private members' bills do not become laws. I do not expect this to become law. I don't want to alarm anybody. But the matter is also debated periodically. More than half of Brits want full-face veils banned. A minister debate needed on veils in some public places, says minister. Now, I don't think for a moment we are turning into France. But I do think this probably means that it would befit us to think carefully about what we do and why we do it in the UK. If we're not clear about the principle of religious freedom, then we end up making decisions based on our own preferences and instincts, and not on what's in keeping, I think, with the interests of all of our citizens and the traditions of the country. So, moving on to religion and public services. I'm going to talk specifically here about the provision of faith schools within our state education system. It's the biggest place where state and faith meet in practice. And it's therefore a good lens through which to look at the role of faith in public service delivery. This is the subject of my PhD, my very slow PhD, but going really well. When I began my doctoral research on the subject, I wanted to understand why it was that we had all these faith schools in our state system. So I went back and researched all of the history of education in Britain, and then, of course, things, as they do, became much clearer. Because the history of education in Britain has been overwhelmingly, for most of its history, the history of faith schools. Of course, there was always education for the rich. There were some grammar schools, then charity schools came in the 17th century, and there was an explosion of Sunday schools during the last 20 years of the 18th century. But Britain entered the 19th century without anything remotely akin to mass education. That all changed very quickly, with the foundation of two bodies in swift succession, with fantastic 19th century names. The National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Established Church, which unaccountably they now just call the National Society, and the British and Foreign Society for the Education of the Labouring and Manufacturing Classes of Society of Every Religious Persuasion, which I call the British and Foreign School Society, or BFSS. The National Society, you may have guessed, believed all children should be educated through a parish school to a curriculum that included biblical study and catechism. In contrast, those gathered around the British and Foreign School Society preferred non-denominational schools, though they still had scripture and Christian principles enshrined in the curriculum. That second view was favoured by most dissenting churches, nonconformists, by some liberal Anglicans and some Roman Catholics and Jews. But the expansion when it came was rapid. The National Society was founded in 1811 with the aim of opening a school in every parish. Within 40 years, it had set up 12,000 schools. And most of those were paid for by individual subscription, individuals giving small amounts of money to get them going. It rose to 17,000 at their peak. The schools were maintained then by the churches, and many still are today. The state didn't get into the education game until 1833, when Parliament offered grants totalling £20,000 towards the building costs of schools. Thereafter, it began to contribute to the expansion of elementary education, although it wasn't until 1847 that any state aid for Catholic schools was finally approved, and therein lies a fascinating story, should anyone want to come back to it. But the year 1870 was a turning point for education in Britain. By that stage, there was a widespread acceptance that we do need mass education, and a recognition that we don't have enough of it. The Reform Act of 1867 increased the number of voters by over 1 million, and that may have triggered concerns about the impact of extending the franchise to a population that most of which were uneducated. The argument was put most famously by a man called Robert Lowe, who was the Vice President of the Committee of Council and Education. It was during a debate in the House of Commons on the extension of the franchise, which he wasn't in favour of, and he raised the issue of compulsory education, saying fabulously, "I believe it will be absolutely necessary that you should prevail on our future masters to learn their letters," which is just the best kind of fantastic Victorian snobbery, 19th century at its peak, in my view. But the government was persuaded they needed to do something, but there was no unanimity on how best to go about it. At that stage, church schools covered about 1/3 of the country. There were many in the established church who wanted the government to formalise the parish school system so everyone could go to their local parish school. At the other end of the spectrum were radicals and other secularists who wanted the government to introduce a truly national system of state education under state control. In fact, the government didn't choose either of those. What they made a decision to do was to go down the middle. They surveyed the country and said, OK, anywhere there isn't provision, we will fill in the gaps with state provision. So we'll leave the church schools there and we'll fill in with state provision anywhere that's not there. That began a long partnership between church and state, what was known as the dual system. In the words of William Cowper Temple, the man whose name is still used today to describe the settlement on religious education, in England, popular education originated with no statesman and was nurtured for no political end. It sprang from the action of the church and the philanthropy of individuals. And churches have supported those schools ever since. In fact, as one commentator rather naughtily put it, seen with any sense of history, secular schools are rather a recent experiment, and it may be too soon to tell if they're a good thing or not. But is there really any case in modern Britain for still having faith schools in the state system? And if so, does it have any implications for the broader issues of faith and state? Well, I suppose the founding argument that's usually made is that parents have a right to send children to the school of their choice. Schools aren't there just to stuff facts into the heads of unsuspecting children. They're there to help them learn and develop as people. That involves relationship. It's a process based on a world view and a value set. Secular schools are no more value-free than faith schools, but in some cases, because they don't explicitly articulate their ethos or the values that underpin their approach to education, it may even be harder to challenge. Faith schools are popular with parents, including with many parents who don't share the founding faith. There are many examples of, for example, Muslim parents wanting their children to go to a church school because they want them educated in a context which takes faith in God seriously. And they often agree with the values that underpin the school, if not with the faith that originates them. And many other people of no faith want to send their children to these schools because they believe they're good schools. So what if we abolished these schools? Well, I'm guessing we probably wouldn't make faith schools illegal. After all, most countries have faith schools. They're just private schools. But what would be the effect of closing the state faith schools or taking them out of the state system? Well, obviously it would provoke protests from the parents who, and the churches, presumably, and other bodies who had built and maintained these schools, in some cases for hundreds of years. But also, I suppose, parents might argue that they would then have to send their children out of the state sector to find them an education for them in a value set with which they were comfortable. And if they couldn't afford the fees, they wouldn't be able to have that option open to them. Also, private schools have fewer controls than state schools, or than most state schools. They don't teach a national curriculum. They face a very different regulatory and inspection regime. But also, I think if faith schools are all private, then you risk driving religion for this sector into the margins of society. Rowan Williams put it like this: if the choice appears to be between systematically secular schools in the public sector and explicitly sectarian schools privately resourced, the dangers should be obvious. Religious conviction becomes something fiercely guarded from the light of public discussion or scrutiny. The way in which it relates to other areas of life and thought can only be looked at in ways that are not publicly accountable. This really is educational ghettoisation. And I guess that's the question. Do we want religion to become something which is genuinely private and secret, talked of with children only in whispers, taught only in madrasas or Sunday schools? Even for those who disapprove, is it not better for faiths to be acknowledged and brought into the public sphere, where the curricula are public and negotiated, where pupils learn to navigate their way through their home culture and the school culture, with enough understanding and overlap between the two to make that an exercise which they can undertake with help and in company? Okay, moving on finally to religious arguments in the public square. Now, anyone here who's from the philosophy or politics will know that most of the writing in this area comes from the United States, and I'm conscious that our systems are so different that caution is needed in transferring work across. All of that being said, the high priest of this territory is unquestionably John Rawls, whose work has set the terms of debate for moral philosophers of the present day, addressing this question, or at least in the abstract. Now, I'm not going to rehearse Rawls' thinking in detail, but I want to extract a few core ideas. Rawls, as some of you will know, set out to construct what he regards as a systematic and practical conception of justice for a constitutional democracy, based on principles of liberty and equality. The most important factor about his conception of justice, as he points out, is that it's practical and not metaphysical or epistemological. In other words, he's not making a truth claim, he's not saying this is what I believe. What he's trying to do is construct something that could serve as the basis for interaction between rational citizens. So for Rawls, a well-ordered society is one whose basic structures satisfy a set of principles of justice which are and are known to be accepted by everybody. He regards reasonable pluralism as being essential, since he believes that an ongoing shared understanding based on any one comprehensive doctrine can only be maintained by the coercive use of state power. Now, one can criticise Rawls for various things, for having too thin a conception of the good, for being obviously primarily American-focused. But the ideas are actually very useful in pointing out one key issue here. At what point is it legitimate for one set of citizens to impose their morality on another? Is it legitimate only if and when we all agree the basis on which such determinations are being made? Now, that's the ground covered by Robert Audi and Nicholas Wolterstorff in a really interesting dialogue. If you're interested in this subject, I commend it to you. It's a book called Religion in the Public Square, The Place of Religious Conviction in Political Debate. It's in the library. Actually, it's not, I've got it out, but I will return it. It will then be in the library. Audi advances an argument for separation of church and state based on liberty, equality and neutrality, before advocating, as he puts it, that one has a prima facie obligation not to advocate or support any law or public policy that restricts human conduct unless one has and is willing to offer adequate secular reason for this advocacy or support. He also says individuals should not support any such initiative unless they can find sufficient motivation on secular grounds, and that churches shouldn't support them at all. Now, Wolterstorff replies by saying that many religious people believe, on the basis of their religious convictions, that they should base their decisions concerning fundamental issues of justice on those religious convictions. So to require them not to base their decisions on their religion is in fact to infringe on their religious freedom. So what does this matter in practice? Well, it matters to me. As it was explained to you by Tom, I'm a member of the House of Lords. And the question about bringing religious arguments into the public square therefore takes on a very practical dimension. And here I think there is wisdom to both Audi and Wolterstorff, but for different reasons. Certainly, to tell parliamentarians that they may not base their views about fundamental issues of justice on their religious convictions would be to infringe on their religious freedom. I should have an absolute right to stand up in the House of Lords and say, my view is X based on my religious convictions. But there are two important caveats to that. The first is if I do that, I should not expect that view to carry any weight whatsoever with anyone who doesn't share my religious convictions. Secondly, I have to remember I'm in the business of making, or in my case more properly, revising legislation. So I have to distinguish between what I believe and what I believe the law should say. So there are, for instance, things I believe are wrong that I don't believe should be illegal. A great example given to me by the principal of my own college. I believe lying is wrong. I don't believe it should be illegal, except in certain specific circumstances, such as perjury in a court of law. But also, I may hold a belief very strongly that something is wrong, but choose to compromise in order to secure what I believe to be the best obtainable outcome. And sometimes alliances emerge from different perspectives, which actually combine to make quite a powerful case. This Easter, one of the stories, must have been a quiet news day from the amount it ran. Garden centres. Anybody hear this? There was a lot of news coverage of gardens, but not all garden centres could open on Easter Sunday, and this is a problem. So this raises the question, which comes up periodically, is should, for example, Sunday trading be fully liberalised? Should every day of the year be exactly the same, Sundays, Easter Sunday, whatever? So how might a person of faith argue this? Well, I think there's a good and a bad way to do this. Let's assume I'm a Christian who is concerned about Sunday becoming just another day. I think a bad argument runs, I'm a Christian, I like to go to church on Sunday, God said we should keep the Sabbath, so nobody should be allowed to shop on a Sunday. A better argument might run, I'm a Christian, God gave us the Sabbath for our own good. Our tradition says it's good for individuals, families and society to have a day when we rest, spend time with each other and concentrate on something other than work, and in our modern world, commerce. Now, if that question, say, were being debated in the House of Lords, I'm pretty sure at that point a peer who had been a trade union official in an earlier life would then stand up and point out that having time off is necessary for retail staff, not just for those who are Christian and want to go to church on a Sunday, but because staff need to have a day off when their families are also free and their children aren't in school. And that whatever assurances they're given by businesses, the staff fear they'll be penalised for not wanting to work on Sundays if Sunday becomes just another day. So this would then lead to an alliance based on different arguments which combine to make the case that as a society, surely we want one day which is genuinely different, which doesn't prioritise work or commerce, which prioritises rest, relationship, community, something other than the relentless demands of modern capitalism. Actually, that's very much the way things work in practice in the House of Lords. As you will all know, we have in the Lords people from all the main party blocks, Labour, Liberal, Conservative. There are then the crossbenchers, independent peers with no party affiliation, and also people from minority parties. We have the Lords Spiritual, 26 bishops of the Church of England. But the Lords are people from very different backgrounds. Some of them still work outside Parliament and come in the evenings, or some come in when, for example, lawyers may come in when a debate about a particular aspect of law is in, or medics on a particular health debate. There are trade unionists, people from charities, people from all kinds of places. We have retired judges. When we have a criminal justice debate, you'll get lots of lawyers and retired judges. We have a former head of the Metropolitan Police, a former chief inspector of prisons, people from the probation service, people who work with charities working with ex-offenders. You'll get the bishops who work with chaplaincy services in prisons, and of course several former Home Secretaries. But that experience of those debates was crystallised for me by the theologian Luke Bretherton, who was at King's College London, now at Duke, who said that the House of Commons is based on geographical constituencies and the House of Lords on vocational constituencies. And actually, as I sat there, I suddenly thought that is exactly what our debates often reveal, a series of speeches from overlapping vocational perspectives, none of which contains the truth, the single truth, but between them create a rich picture which actually has truth in it. The bishops can contribute, often ironically, from a geographical perspective, because they're actually the only people in the House of Lords who in fact are there representing a particular geographical part of the country, as well as most of them having a brief or two health or education, or some such. The Lords also has distinguished members of other faiths, including the former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs and Lord Singh, Inderjit Singh, as was, and there are Muslim peers on both government and opposition benches. But the distinctive feature of the Lords is that people represent a range of communities of interest. So when that House of Lords debate on Sunday trading would likely have people offering a range of vocational perspectives, religious voices sharing the wisdom from their traditions, trade unions talking about workers, business people sharing their knowledge, former politicians talking about their constituencies or their ministerial jobs. And especially on a conscience question, the House listens and then deliberates, and sometimes it asks the elected House to think again. Now, if all peers followed Audi's instruction and offered only secular arguments, that would be a much less rich debate, much more one-dimensional. And ultimately, I think it's a fallacy to assume that there is a single, good, neutral way of deciding key issues of justice without reference to our own belief systems, whether religious or political. As Michael Sandel, the public philosopher, put it, In many cases, it's not possible to decide these big questions of policy, law, justice and rights without presupposing some account of the good life or the goods at stake in particular social practices. So it's not as if, I would argue, we have available, he says, a safe, risk-free, neutral alternative. The alternative is to decide these questions in a way that does presuppose some answer to big moral questions without acknowledging it, and without subjecting those underlying moral assumptions to critical examination and democratic deliberation. Sandel also takes this argument into the crucial territory of tolerance. He says, even where it's possible to decide a question of justice and rights without entering into underlying moral considerations, it may not be desirable, because the toleration that's achieved by avoidance may be a thin and fragile kind of toleration. I would argue instead, he said, for the kind of toleration that flows from explicit engagement with the competing moral and spiritual convictions that people bring to public life, which is a sturdier basis for a just society, but it's also a sturdier foundation for the pluralism and toleration that liberals are aiming at. So, a few conclusions before I stop. That, I have to say, is where I would plant my flag if called upon to do so, at least today. So what do I think emerges from some of the issues I've discussed? Well, first, I think, and most obviously, there is no neutral worldview. And yes, I'm sorry, but that definitely includes secular humanism. Telling everybody else that they must exclude their own worldviews from the public square doesn't count as neutrality. Second, we have to remember that for many people of faith, that faith may be the most important thing in their lives. It is commonly their most important identifier. There are many dimensions to my identity. I'm female, I'm a Labour politician, I'm a supporter of Durham County Cricket Club, yes. But also I'm a Christian. And actually of those, the fact that I'm a Christian is without question the most important aspect of my identity, because it affects every aspect of my life. So we must remember to be very careful that when we ask people to lay aside the things of faith, that's a costly thing to do. But we also need to remember that faith is rarely an individual exercise. That's one of the ways I think that secular humanism often misunderstands faith. Any approach that's predicated solely on the individual risks simply talking past those many faiths which are grounded in community experience and community expressions. Thirdly, people of the same faith may take different views about what they think their faith demands of them. Wearing crosses, wearing scarves. But that divergence doesn't mean those things are not important to adherents. This also applies to the belief in core tenets of religion. Earlier on, I quoted David Cameron talking about a perceived woolliness when it came to belief on the part of the Church of England. I think it's actually rather more complicated than that. I first came to faith a few years ago and became part of the Church of England, and I thought at the beginning that its members didn't believe things very strongly. I then came to realise that they, or rather we, do believe things very strongly. They're just not the same things. And I then further realised that actually that capacity to hold together in one body people who have radically different understandings of the meanings of belief, and particularly of religious practices, is hugely significant. It's very countercultural, certainly for someone who comes from the world of politics, where any slight sign of difference is seen as a sign of a weakness and seized upon by critics and by the media. And I actually find it a very attractive characteristic, but it's also a very challenging one, because it means I'm in fellowship with people with whom I disagree, sometimes profoundly, about things that matter to me a lot. So it becomes an exercise both in reminding myself of what matters most, and also a frequent reminder of the possibility, however slight, that I might occasionally be wrong. But that aspect, I think, of the Church of England also tells us quite a lot about our history. A few years ago, I heard Giles Fraser give a talk at the Greenbelt Festival, and I'm going to give you my memory of this. In the way of memory, I have no idea if this is what he said, but it's what I heard him say, so it therefore has a validity in my mind, if not in his. I've never been able to check this with him. At some point, I must find out if he actually said this. But he was talking about the English Civil War, and that he'd had a conversation with the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, and they'd been comparing what the countries learned from their respective civil wars. And the conclusion was that what the Americans learned from their civil war was that it was important to be right, and it was important to win. And then what we learned from our civil war was that it was very dangerous to fall out over religion, because families split and lots of people died. Finally, acknowledging difference doesn't automatically, in my view, increase division. Some of the best engagement I've seen across community divides, both in Parliament and in my Refugee Council days, has been through interactions between churches and other faith groups. I still periodically hear the criticism that the problem with faith groups is that they have what's called plenty of bonding capital, but no bridging capital. In other words, they're people who share a very strong value set and maybe some culture, so they got on really well together, but they can't get on with their neighbours because of that. And there's a small step, then, to deciding that religion is private and must be kept so for the sake of the shared public good. But anyone who believes that still should look at what happens in community organising, groups like London Citizens. Where, or if you don't get to see it, again, read the book by Luke Bretherton called Christianity in Contemporary Politics. He does an analysis of London Citizens and community organising. But the experience of community organising demonstrates, I think, how mistaken is the view that deeply held beliefs necessarily get in the way of social cohesion. Because in religion, as in so much else that matters, particularity is all. It's in speaking to each other of our own truths that we get to know each other and to forge the basis for shared understanding, shared vision, and ultimately action. The other key insight from Luke's study was that where these groups come together to take action, the best focus for that shared action is not some abstract notion of the public good, but common goods, which are not just the aggregation of individual self-interest, what you want and you want and you want and I want, but as he puts it, goods in which the flourishing of each is dependent on the flourishing of all. I think there's a lesson in that for politics and indeed for life, that we're all interdependent, bound to one another, and a society which understands that, a truly well-ordered society, would indeed be one where the flourishing of each depends on the flourishing of all. Actually, I think we already live in that society, in a society which depends on precisely that. We just don't always recognise it. Thank you.